The Four Noble Truths are a system of thought that encapsulates what Buddhism is all about, which is understanding what causes suffering in our lives and what path we must follow to achieve liberation from, or at the very least, non-attachment to that suffering. For this reason, if you're going through a tough time in your own life or are trying to navigate how one should respond to suffering, I think the Four Noble Truths are a really good basic framework to keep in mind, even if you disagree with Buddhist claims about how we should respond to suffering. The Four Noble Truths are thought to be some of the Buddha's first distinct teachings, and they are representative of how Buddha charted his personal path from dissatisfaction in his life towards liberation and enlightenment. While there are continuities to be found in the central teachings of Buddhism, as found in the Four Noble Truths, it is by no means a monolithic philosophy or religious system. Different schools of Buddhism have prioritized certain ideas put forward by the Buddha over others in constructing their principal beliefs and in interpreting the Four Noble Truths. The first Noble Truth can be thought of as Buddhism's diagnosis of why it is we suffer or what processes lead to suffering. In simple terms, it suggests life is, on some level, inherently unsatisfactory due to the continual presence of forms of suffering in our lives. But to understand this, we need to clarify a few key terms. Samsara, often translated as the whirl of existence, is a notion that all existence is typified by cyclical and unceasing change. This is an idea we find at the core of many Indian philosophical traditions, that all things are inherently cyclical, whether it be physical matter, our lives as human beings, or the spinnings of the earth. For Buddhists, this is epitomized in the way that we are bound to an ongoing set of deaths and rebirths until we achieve liberation from the cycle of samsara. This process of samsara then creates three characteristics which are pretty much universal to human existence. Dukkha, translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness, suggests that existence is and always will lead to deep unsatisfactoriness, because whatever we attach ourselves to is transient and impermanent. This leads cleanly into the concept of anicca, or impermanence, the idea that all conditioned existence is transient, evanescent, inconstant. This concept is represented in the Epiphany of Kundana, one of the early ascetics of Buddhism, who remarked that whatever is subject to origination is also subject to cessation, because all worldly things ultimately pass away or fade into nothing. Finally, within the first noble truth, we have the concept of anatta, roughly translated as non-self or no essence. Following on from the observations before that all forms of existence are impermanent, so too does Buddha suggest the self cannot be thought of either as an independent or permanent entity. Rather, early Buddhists were aiming for the realization of selflessness through escaping the cycle of samsara and suffering. We get a really good summary of this first noble truth within the following quote, where Buddha suggests that association with things not liked is pain, separation from desired things is pain, not getting what one wants is pain. In short, the five aggregates of grasping are pain. So Buddha here is suggesting that as humans we tend to hold on to our feelings, our sense of physical body, our sensory perception of the world, as well as our sense of an independent self, or a consciousness behind all this. Now, this can be a powerful realization in our lives when we properly internalize it. But how do we actually understand what drives this process? Well, this is explained within the second noble truth, or samudaya, roughly translated as the origin of suffering, which basically explains the mechanisms and the driving forces which generate suffering in our lives and continue the process of endless rebirth. A key mechanism which drives suffering is tanha, the craving or attachment to impermanent things. People have a tendency to interpret as permanent things which are on some level really impermanent, and this is a source of much pain in our lives. We do this even with our thoughts, especially by identifying with the thoughts our brain creates and interpreting them as true, rather than creating distance with them by recognizing how quickly they fade away. Buddha in one sutta identifies this as the craving which leads to re-becoming, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for becoming, and craving for disbecoming. Similarly, in Buddha's fire sermon in the Tripitaka, the five senses of sounds, aromas, flavors, tactile sensations, and even the intellect are all indicative of craving and desire, and are therefore metaphorized as the fire of delusion, the fire of aversion. To break this down, even the use of our basic senses culminates in suffering, for they lead us to be self-deluded, clinging towards that which we cannot maintain. Again, this is what underlies the Buddhist sense of anatta, that the attachment to a rigid sense of self is also a delusion, because there is no enduring self. We, too, are merely part of the ceaseless becoming of the universe. Finally, clinging and craving is also what effectively produces karma, which according to Walpola Rahula is the theory of cause and effect of action and reaction. It is the idea that our intentions and the way we act in one life, whether good or bad, will produce some effect in another life. Not only is karma the driving force behind the endless process of birth and rebirth, which I mentioned before, it also leads to the idea that it is mostly the intention behind an action which determines its moral weight. For Buddhists, this intention can be weighed in terms of how much it contributes to the well-being of others in particular. The third noble truth, however, states that a cessation of dukkha and the attainment of enlightenment is possible. This is achieved through nirodha, which is basically the ability to control craving and extinguish our attachment to impermanent things, resulting in nirvana, the utter eradication of desire and clinging. This allows us to transcend the endless deaths and rebirths of samsara. The third noble truth requires the complete absence of desire in the mind, understanding and absence of dukkha, and a liberating insight into the true nature of existence. But note that the Buddha is not endorsing that we give up or repress all of our emotions and sensations, but rather cultivate the ability to rise above incoming sensations, rather than practice attachment towards them. The third noble truth is described as the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it, with non-reliance being the crucial term here. Peter Harvey also suggests that this is what's at the core of achieving nirvana, for nirvana is not subject to time and change, and so is known as the unborn. To attain this state, all phenomena subject to birth must be transcended by means of non-attachment. This might seem like a nice ideal, but the next obvious question is how we actually go about achieving the path towards enlightenment. Well, the fourth noble truth answers this question directly by setting out the noble eightfold path, the general steps that allow Buddhists to achieve unbinding from samsara by cultivating a right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Obviously, this seems fairly general, but it's what the rest of the Buddhist tradition attempts to lay out in much greater complexity and depth. In general terms, Buddhism teaches that self-restraint, disciplining of the mind through mindfulness and meditation, as well as ethical conduct, can gradually stop the flow of craving and clinging if practiced properly. There are three key stages to the Eightfold Path then: the cultivation of concentration, insight and wisdom, as well as virtue and ethical behavior. However, note that the idea of a path here can be misleading, because there's not a series of independent steps we take in an ordered fashion. All of the stages of the path rely on each other, and should ideally be practiced simultaneously. So what would someone who had followed and understood the Four Noble Truths look like? Well, in the last days of the Buddha Sutta, it is said that when the Four Noble Truths are realized and penetrated, cut off is the craving for existence, destroyed is that which leads to renewed becoming, and there is no fresh becoming. The reality is, of course, even if you are a practicing Buddhist, it's highly unlikely you'd be able to attain such a state of enlightenment. But I think these Buddhist tenets still give us quite a useful philosophy, because they set out something radically different to the approach which pervades much of modern culture, which amplifies and encourages clinging towards impermanent things and desires. Also, as with many other philosophies, you can see Buddhism's moral philosophy more as a project, something that can be learned intuitively and practiced gradually in a way that works for your own life. What I've given in this video is only a simple summary of a topic and belief system that is, of course, immensely more complicated. But I hope I've given you an idea of the basic tenets and philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism, if it's something you actually want to engage with further. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, as well as telling me what you thought of the video in general.